Okay, in today's video we're going to talk about different types of chemical bonding. We have ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. We're going to talk about each of those. Now, when we talk about this, you need a little bit of background on the energy shells called the electron shells, which are basically the electrons in the shells around the nucleus. And so your first electron shell has a maximum of 2. Every other shell after that has a maximum of 8. One thing you have to understand is that these molecules or these elements have a propensity to have that outer shell filled. So they will always react with other elements in the nature to fill that shell. Now, inert elements are elements that have that outer shell filled, so they don't generally want to react with other elements. Whereas elements that are missing electrons in that outer shell want to complete the outer shell. So that's where we kind of dive into the different types of bonding. Okay? So what happens is this. If we have ionic bonding, what we're going to do is we're going to create ions. Now, you have positive ions, which are called cations, and you have negative ions, which are called anions. And so chloride, like Cl minus, that's an anion, a negative ion, and sodium or potassium, sodium is Na plus, potassium is K plus, those are positive ions, okay? Now what you do with ionic bonding is it is an actual transfer of electrons. And so what's going to happen is one element is going to donate an electron and one element is going to receive an electron. Now, when an element is has an electron lost or loses an electron, it is called oxidation. So oxidation is the loss of an electron. And if you gain an electron as an element, then you are reduced. Okay? So gain an electron reduced, lose an electron oxidized, and you're going to have these elements work with each other to do this, right? So you're going to have, let's say, sodium and chloride. Okay? Sodium in its outer shell has 1 electron and chloride has 7. So these are a perfect match for each other. Sodium can actually donate its 1 electron to chloride, and then they both have 8 in their outer shell, creating this ionic bond. Okay? That's really all I want to say about ionic bonding. It's a transfer. So sodium is transferring its 1 electron in that outer shell to chloride, and then chloride now has 8 in its outer shell, and then we drop out of that last shell with sodium, right, that had the 1, we donated the 1, so now the previous shell is filled with 8. So their outer shell, which is called the valence shell, I didn't mention that yet, but the valence shell is the outer shell, that the propensity is again to be filled, and if it's anything outside the first shell, it wants 8, and so that fulfills that law there, okay? So, now we'll move into a different type of bonding. We have something called covalent bonding. Covalent bonding is a sharing of electrons. The analogy that I like to use is we have this thing called dual enrollment where a student can take a high school class but also get college credit for it. And so I think of this covalent bonding as a dual enrollment because you get to use an electron and share it, and that shared electron sort of gets credit for both elements as being an electron for both elements, so to speak. And so here's what's going to happen with covalent bonding. You're going to have, let's use carbon and hydrogen. Hydrogen only has 1 electron, so its outer shell is its only shell. And it wants 2, right? Because there's a maximum of 2 in that first shell, so it wants 1 more electron. And then carbon has 4 in its outer shell, so let's just use different molecules here. And so we have, we'll say this is carbon, right? We'll go here. Carbon with its 4 electrons in the outer shell, hydrogen with its 1 electron. What we can do is we can share electrons. And so the carbon is sharing its electron and the carbon, and then the hydrogen is sharing its electron, okay? And so we've got 4 electrons that carbon can share, which means there can be 4 separate hydrogens. So now we're talking about methane gas. So we've got 4 hydrogens bound to the carbon, and they're each sharing electrons. So each one of the hydrogen is sharing its electron. So it's basically sharing 4 because of the 4 hydrogens. And carbon has 4 in its outer shell, and it's sharing 1 of the 4 with each of the 4 hydrogens, if that's making sense. And so we have a sharing of electrons. So carbon feels satisfied that it's sharing 4 electrons with 4 hydrogens, right? So it's getting the extra 4 that it needs to complete its outer shell. And hydrogen's getting each of the 4 hydrogens is getting 1 that's sharing, completing its outer shell, so to speak. Okay? That's called covalent bonding. Now,